I really, really welcome the investment in research. I think that's what we need, is good quality research to inform practice. And without that, we're really flying blind, and you get back to the dark ages of making recommendations that are just not based on evidence, like with, say, orthomolecular medicine, for example. That can be problematic. So we need the evidence, and we really welcome the research. And I can't wait until this research is published.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Drew Ramsey. I'm going to be your host. And today is a really, really wonderful episode. Historic, I would say, because we're speaking to someone who, in my world of nutritional psychiatry, is just simply historic. We have with us today Felice Jacka. Felice Jacka is, first of all, she is a Medal of the Order of Australia, which is one of the highest honors you can receive in her country. And that is because of what she has done for nutritional psychiatry. She's the Alfred Deakin Professor of Nutritional Psychiatry. She's co-director of the Food and Mood Center at Deakin University, and she's the founder and the president of the International Society of Nutrition and Psychiatry Research, of which I'm also a member and one of the founding members. And she's really been responsible for establishing the core literature in our field. And by establishing, I was just getting ready for this interview and thinking, I should catch up on what Felice has put out. Well, this year in 2023, we're in August, she's already, by my count, had 22 publications out. And these are major impact factor publications. And that has put her in the top. She is in the top 0.1% of published scientists worldwide. And so Felice, it is such an honor to have you with us. You've been such a wonderful support of me on the clinical side, trying to understand how can we really shake things up in mental health by including nutrition. From my very first book to my wild kale days, it's just always been a treat to speak with you, to get to have your mentorship over the years, to get to present in front of you back in Maryland at the International Society of Nutrition and Psychiatry Research. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, look, it's such a pleasure. And it's always so lovely to see you, Drew, because you've been the psychiatrist who's been putting the research into practice. And there are so few of you, and we really, really hope that the future sees many, many more yous out there really translating the research to benefits to patients.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think there have been a number of folks interested in this, whether they're chefs who care about mental health, or whether they're farmers who know their food is just healthier, or whether they're our colleagues who've always mentioned a little bit of lifestyle in there, slid it in. I thought maybe we just start, because you have such a fascinating career. I don't think people realize you came to this level of science a little bit later in your career. If you could just tell people, if it's even possible, a little snippet about you and your career.
Yeah, it's certainly non-conventional and was very circuitous. But I guess, like many people, I had a history of anxiety disorder, major depression during my adolescence and early years. And of course, that's very common. But in my 20s, I studied fine art. So I was, an artist. But I was always very interested in psychology, because as I got older and I got better, I started to read more and wanting to know more. So I went back to university and did a psychology degree. And while I was doing that, I sort of realized that I wasn't really cut out to be a psychologist per se, but that I was very interested in the brain and the biological aspects of why we are the way we are, how we work. And of course, the brain, being the most complex thing that we know of in the universe, is endlessly fascinating. But also, as I did my early studies, starting to recognize that the field of psychiatry was shifting to take into account the fact that everything that happens in terms of your mental health doesn't just happen in the brain. It's a whole body issue. And so your immune system in particular is involved. And so while I was studying my psychology degree, I became very interested in research and the new research in the area. And I moved into research by basically volunteering at a research unit. And then I went on and did my fourth year, and then got a scholarship to do my PhD. And when I proposed my PhD topic to my supervisor, who was wonderfully and endlessly supportive, He didn't know anything about nutrition. He didn't know anything about epidemiology, but he was supportive enough to say, well, yep, go for it. Because I was an older student, I think I was able to take that forward. So I proposed to look at this link between nutrition and common mental disorders. So that's clinical depressive and anxiety disorders in a large cohort of women who are very representative of the Australian population. So that was my PhD, and people thought that I was a bit nuts, I think. They really, because nutrition was not considered to be something serious, that serious scientists and, medical professionals would really look at. But I did my PhD, and not surprising to me, but I think surprising to many others, it supported my hypotheses. And then that PhD was published on the cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry. So it had a big impact. And that was pretty cool. And it allowed me to then go on and really extend the work that I'd been doing in many different countries with different collaborators and across different age groups. And then I sort of went from there.
Well, that paper was historic, and later we're going to talk about the history of nutritional psychiatry. But I think it's important for everyone, especially everyone interested in science or thinking about a career, to hear that this is Felice's graduate thesis that ends up opening up really a whole field. Certainly people were interested in dietary pattern, but this is the first time I'm aware of in the Green Journal, the American Journal of Psychiatry, really in the US, the top impact factor journal publishes the study, a correlational study looking and finding that a traditional dietary pattern had some protective factors when it came to depression and anxiety. A Western dietary pattern showed more depression and anxiety, and that then has led to this really storied career. If you think about it, the development of the first center dedicated to this in Australia. So we begin with you as a graduate student, and I'm wondering if we can just fast forward. Maybe it's a little too fast. In your words, Felice Jacka, where is nutritional psychiatry today?
Well, it's really at a very interesting juncture because it's had a big impact. The work that we've led has been reflected, cited in more than 100 very high-level policy documents around the world. As one example, the WHO now lists unhealthy diet as a risk factor for mental disorders. So it's getting that recognition, I guess, by leading organisations. We also have had an impact on clinical guidelines. So in Australia, which is kind of cool, and maybe even it happened even faster than what I expected, but the recommendations, the clinical guidelines from the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatry for the treatment of mood disorders now place what is essentially lifestyle medicine as the foundation of treatment. And they call it foundational, and they also call it non-negotiable. So this is addressing diet, addressing movement, sleep, and substance cessation. So those clinical guidelines are out there now, and of course there's a treatment gap that we can talk about in terms of education for psychiatrists. And then last year we published the first set of international clinical guidelines for the application of lifestyle medicine in mental health care in depression. And that was the result of 3 years of work and a global task force that we led.
Felice, we're at a place where policy is being influenced by all the amazing research that you, Michael Burke, and your robust team, and I want to hear all about the Mood and Food Center in a little bit, all of what you all are doing. You've also really moved into the clinical space, and as you note, helping clinical guidelines. And I'm wondering, just to start off, when you think about everyone listening and some of the assessments that you do in the Mood and Food Center, and just some of the quick things you've learned. Like I always joke on almost every episode, I say lentils because I just feel like it's one of those things, right? Lentils.
People do call me Professor Beans.
Professor Beans. So Professor Beans, what are some of the quick top nutritional psychiatry lessons that you find yourself returning to that really delight you?
So we've got our Food and Mood Academy now, which has accredited training for psychiatrists and other health professionals. And a big part of that is taking those the research and making it simple, accessible, and something that can be delivered by psychiatrists who don't have necessarily training in nutrition. And it really does boil down to these incredibly simple messages, which is eat lots of different types of plant foods. So that's vegetables, fruits, whole grains of different types, beans and lentils, big favorite, nuts and seeds, herbs and spices, all of these things that have all of these thousands of phytonutrients, phytochemicals in them, fiber, etc. So lots of different types of plant foods. Um, Diversity, very important. So, not just eating the same things over and over again, and avoiding as much as possible ultra processed foods. And then I always say, look, throw in a bit of fermented foods because we're doing some really interesting research in that area, and I think it holds a lot of promise. So, they're quite simple messages. People don't need to be vegetarian or vegan, although, if you're lucky enough to be able to source meat that is not coming from industrial farms, then you're fortunate. Here in Australia, we have wild deer that are pests, and we have people who are trained to go out and shoot them and butcher them, and they're living in the forest. They have they're eating from real soil that's full of microbes and full of nutrients, and then we're getting it fresh, and we're able to have that. So that's what I have. Healthy fats, of course. Extra virgin olive oil is a very, very big item in the pantry of most of our food and mood centre team.
No, that also sounds like the recommendations that we've been teaching the Mental Fitness Kitchen and in our course, right? This notion of really going plant forward, but also thinking of diversity. And then really what I like about nutritional psychiatry so much is how quickly we translate the science, that research comes out around fermented foods and just the real interesting notion of how they influence immune response, how really fermented foods seem to be what influence alpha diversity and shift the microbiome. And so we can add those in as we're sitting with patients in real time in a way that's very exciting to me, and it feels where the field has changed, that patients come in and they say, they ask about this stuff. Should I be eating this? And what can I do in a way that when we first met 15 years ago or so, right, that wasn't the case. It was still
No.
really much more like, why are you asking me about my food?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the important thing, though, is to make it very accessible, very simple and affordable for people, because many people don't have cooking skills these days. I have to say, I'm not much of a cook. I'm very, very slapdash, and I just throw things together, and I use a lot of pre-prepared, pre-cut salads and tin beans and things like that. But very importantly, that the recommendations we make are accessible to people. They're not expensive. I mean, beans and lentils are as cheap as chips. But for some people, it's hard to access fresh food, and we say frozen vegetables, fantastic. These types of solutions, I guess, to some of the problems that people have in preparing fresh food or having things available. So that's an important aspect of this, not making it a message that's only accessible to people who have money to be able to afford lovely organic food or the time to prepare it.
Yeah, we have a little PDF, Brain Food on a Budget, that I'll link to, where we go over this because it's such a common question, right? This food's really too expensive. And one of the findings in the SMILES trial that was so exciting, and I quote all the time, is actually when individuals moved from ultra-processed food and fast food and embraced the dietary pattern that you taught them in the SMILES trial, they saved 140, I think it was Australian dollars a month.
We did a very detailed cost analysis. We had a health economist, and also one of the people who was involved with the trial did a very detailed cost analysis, and they costed everything that people were eating when they came into the trial, compared to what we were recommending, and our diet was actually less expensive.
Yeah, and I think it's important to appreciate some things, like a big jug of olive oil, can be costly. Some of these food items, like wild salmon or fish, can be costly, but there are also other forms. Tinned fish, I talk a lot about clinically with patients. Wild salmon burgers is a recipe I really love in my most recent book, and that people, it just makes it accessible. Felice, you were really generous to talk about your own mental health a little bit, and I'm just wondering, for you, what are some of the foods that really help you with your mental health and that are go-to for you?
Look, my basic diet's pretty good because I've always eaten quite well. So it's those basic things that we talked about. So really plant focused and lots of diversity. I use yogurt a lot. I just made my own buckwheat bread the other day from some recipe I found on the internet. I really enjoy Instagram. There are so many great recipes on there now, and I really enjoy just trying some of those. And I tend to eat quite
At least
well.
the nutritional psychiatrist in me, I'm sorry to cut you off, the nutritional psychiatrist in me wants to point out earlier, you said you weren't much of a cook, and now you're telling us about the wonderful things and the inspiration you find in Instagram and recipes that you love. And so I just want to point that out as a nutritional psychiatrist. There's something going on there. 'Cause
Well, they're all
it
very
sounds to
simple
me.
recipes. Like they're not. I mean, for Christmas, I'd look at a Yotam Ottolenghi book. Ottolenghi does these beautiful, complicated recipes with plants that are just so delicious, but they can also take half a day and, half your wallet to prepare. So that's for Christmas. But during the week, it's really simple stuff like tinned beans and lots of different, like I use brown rice or barley, things like this. I've got one of these microwave rice cookers, things that are very simple, tinned tomatoes, frozen veggies. We use all of these things because during the week we're very busy. What I find more to the point that really affects my mental health, I really struggle sometimes with not drinking alcohol because alcohol is, a good wine is something that I really, really love and I've always loved, but I
Mm.
really find that it has a shocking effect on me. The more you read about what alcohol actually is as a neurotoxin, I find now even one drink really makes me feel terrible. So I have to really work on avoiding that, which is hard because it's such a lovely thing to do. It's a social thing, it's a part of a Mediterranean diet to have a bit of red wine. But that really messes with me. And not moving really messes with me as well. Not that I'm any sort of marathon
Mm.
runner, but just walks and getting out and going up and down stairs and just anything that gets me moving makes a huge difference. And I think that was the thing that really helped me. I had a very severe major depressive episode when I was 19 that lasted many months. And I was really, really unwell. And I started running. And again, I wasn't running, huge distances, but I was just doing it every day. And that helped a lot.
It's such a huge part when you see someone who's struggling with their mood where they can, and it's hard, as you know, right, down having maybe motivation or energy and not feeling optimistic. I find running, it's just a tough thing. Felice, thank you so much for sharing openly about your mental health. It also feels that that's one of the shifts that's happened, and one of the ways that I really feel nutritional psychiatry has helped me personally and professionally, which is I get to talk to so many people, sure, about food, but we're always talking about mental health, whether I'm in a school or a church or community organization. And especially 15 years ago, when it was harder for us to talk openly about mental health, nutritional psychiatry just felt like such a wonderful way to give us a window for, especially for people who, for whatever reasons, have concerns about mental health or psychiatry or medications or psychotherapy. And with nutritional psychiatry, that's okay. We can still talk all about your mental health and even think about maybe some things to do. Is maybe just, as you said, a foundational first step.
Yeah. And I mean, everybody has mental health of one sort or another, and everybody eats. It's something that joins us. The human experience is universal. And something like 50% of people will have a, mental disorder of some point over the course of their life. It's super, super common. And in some ways, I think we can over medicalize it and not recognize that it really is just part of the human experience. Sometimes that's really, really tough, but to embrace humanity in all of its diversity, its neurodiversity, its psychiatric diversity, and accept complexity is something that humans tend to try and avoid, I think. They like simple answers and simple fixes. And this is one of the reasons I think with in medicine too, there's the impulse to have a pill straight up. And now, that's not to say that there's not a really important role for medications. And, I've found them incredibly helpful in my life. But the foundation, the platform that every function in your body pretty much comes from what you put in your mouth. So if you don't get that petrol right, nothing else is going to work all that well.
Well, I will say that without getting some of these factors, we've been calling them mental fitness a lot with this idea of, we all have some notion, maybe a little guilt every week. Did we or didn't we do physical fitness? Well, I want us all to have that same feeling about mental fitness, right? That there are things that we each can do. You share with us something that I think people really struggle with, and I see this clinically, and I'd really love for you to share a little of how being one of our leaders in nutritional psychiatry, who's I call you the tip of the spear, right? It's like we're following you into the fray, and I'm just loving that. How do you sort out that kind of food and medicine kind of combination?
Look, I think when you look at the literature, there's only, out of the several trials that have now been published, there's only one where people were not on other forms of treatment. Certainly in our SMILES trial, pretty much everyone was having another sort of treatment, mainly antidepressants, but also psychotherapy. And we would never, ever put this as an either or equation. It's more that nutrition, as I said, is like the fundamental petrol. If you get that right, everything else that you do is going to work a whole lot better. So getting those basic factors right, and sleep is a big part of it. Physical movement, of course, doesn't need to be the gym, and food. That's your platform, and then you build everything else on top of that, and it's going to work a hell of a lot better if you do that. So I don't think it should be pitched as one or the other. But for some people, making lifestyle changes will be sufficient to help them, and they won't need medication. For others, they will find medication also very, very helpful. I can talk about a really important trial that we've just finished, Drew, that speaks to that, other forms of therapy versus lifestyle medicine, if you like.
Yeah, could you? I'd love to hear about it. I just think that it's really important for everyone to hear that, you know, each of us have this complex mix, and some people, no matter how well they get the brain food, will always need some medication of some type or some therapy, and others, are going to have different experiences. Times off meds, time on, times that their diet really helps, time it doesn't. And I just really appreciate you acknowledging that. It was one of the things I love about the SMILES trial, because first, everyone, the SMILES trial is this landmark trial, 2017. Felice and her colleagues show for the first time ever that a Mediterranean diet is used as adjunctive treatment for clinical depression. So patients who, as you mentioned, were already getting some care, and teaching the Mediterranean diet, 32.3% went into full remission from their depression. I'm kind of curious, what are some of your favorite outcomes? And I know that trial was so long ago, but it's so historic.
Yeah, and there's been several since. And I think one of the most interesting was very recently in young men with clinical depression. And similar to the SMILES trial, it was moderate to severe clinical depression. And young men are a really tough bunch to get to, shift their diet. But I think if people understand that this is about how they feel, about how they think, how they operate, not about how they look. I think so much of the emphasis on diet is about appearance, and it's such a silly thing to focus on. So they did change their diet, and they experienced a similar degree of improvement to what we saw in the SMILES trial. Now, in the SMILES trial, people, as I said, some of them were very sick, and they'd been very sick for a very long time. And they did shift their diet with the help of a dietitian. They just gradually made those important changes. One of the things we've done, and we've just submitted this to be peer reviewed, is we've looked at the data in detail, and it looks like reducing ultra-processed food seems to be a really big part of that equation and why people improved in their mental health. We saw in the SMILES trial that people who changed their diet got the most benefit. So in other words, there was a very tight link between the degree to which people improved their dietary quality and the degree to which they improved. We also did an economic evaluation with a health economist who looked at all sorts of data and showed that there was a roughly $2,500 Australian cost saving per participant in the SMILES trial, because people who were in the dietary group compared to the social support group, they lost less time out of their daily roles, and they saw other health practitioners less often. So what that's saying is it's not just helping their mental health, it's helping them in their life to function, to feel better. They saw doctors less often. So it seemed to be a much more global impact on their health. So that's really exciting. And our Australian government, I mean, in America and Australia, all across the Western world, governments are really struggling with the mental health workforce and the fact that we don't have enough psychologists and psychiatrists and people to treat mental health problems. One of the studies we've just completed recently was a very important study. It's called a non-inferiority trial. So, what it's aiming to do is to see whether one treatment is at least as good as another treatment. And it's what we call a pragmatic trial. So, it's a real world trial. And in this big study, which was run through COVID, people were randomly assigned, people with elevated psychological distress, and some of them were, long-term people living with psychosis. Others were people just experiencing COVID-induced anxiety. They were randomly assigned to get either diet and exercise support delivered by a dietitian, exercise physiologist, or psychotherapy, gold standard CBT, delivered by psychologists. And the aim was to see whether lifestyle support was at least as helpful as psychological support, which is, gold standard treatment. Now, I can't tell you the answer because it's under review at the moment, but let's just say we were very, very interested and excited by the results. And our government is very interested in these results and the fact that we're doing now a national trial across the whole of Australia in primary care, people with mood disorders, to again test that equation, because doctors and practitioners and policymakers and politicians want to know, okay, if someone has to wait 6 months to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, can I safely get them to go and see a dietitian and or exercise physiologist and know that I'm not just leaving them without care, that I'm doing the right thing by the patient? This is a really important question, and this is what these trials set out to answer. The results, I think, are super, super interesting.
Felice, I'm wondering about some of your pet peeves when it comes to nutritional psychiatry and the way that some people are putting the message out there.
So one of the things that is a big, and you would understand this, a big problem in the field generally is that most medical practitioners get almost no training in nutrition. And so this is what we aim to address, because many, many practitioners, and I guess you've probably experienced this, we know from global surveys, they're making recommendations about supplements, they're making recommendations about diet that are not based on the evidence because they don't have that training. And so this is what our training in nutritional psychiatry and the Food and Mood Academy attempts to address. This is where the evidence is, and this is how you best apply it. But it doesn't need to be complicated, and that's the point that we always get across. And I think one of the first things I saw you present was about those simple questions that you ask in practice. Things like, what do you eat for breakfast? What do you eat for lunch? What do you like? What don't you like? What's your idea of a healthy diet? Those sorts of simple questions and messages that are the most helpful.
Yeah, well, I think part of that was being a psychiatrist and coming to the field of nutrition really through the lens of psychiatry, which I think is a little, the opposite, that often we're, thinking about mental health and then asking our colleagues and nutrition and dietetics to kind of help implement a plan. And I think what I saw initially was a concern that the recommendations that were being made weren't actually practical or actionable, or, eat less salt. It's not really relevant if you eat a whole foods diet, right? That's for people who are eating highly processed foods all the time. That's where the salt comes from. Don't eat cholesterol. Most people, that just means don't eat meat. If you're struggling financially, or you want really like high value, good protein, you have a high quality meat, farmer near you, let's say, that can be a great choice. And so as a physician, it felt like in medicine, we were a little confused about how to engage with patients around food, and we were doing it really badly. It feels like where mental health has a huge opportunity. And I feel that America is certainly embracing that a little bit more, because I was getting to see patients, a lot of them in therapy every week, every couple of weeks. And with that amount of frequency, to not start understanding, hey, Like, how do you organize your food, and how's it a part of your concept of self and nourishing the self? And wow, you keep having panic attacks after you haven't had an appetite, haven't eaten. Like, what are interventions that can work?
Mm.
And so
And
it's really.
I think that you've used a really important word there, Drew, and that's nourishing. Because as I said, so much of the messaging around food has been around obesity and the obesity epidemic and people's body size. We know in nutritional psychiatry, the research tells us that the link between diet quality and mental health is independent of body size. In the SMILES trial, the average body mass index was 30, which is overweight, obese. That didn't change, yet people's mental health massively improved when they changed their diet. So, getting away from this idea about body size and appearance, which is a very stigmatizing and very difficult endpoint to change, and instead say, let's think about nourishing your brain, nourishing your spirit, nourishing your gut, nourishing your body, nourishment, doing something good and wonderful for yourself, not punishing, not restriction, not misery. That's the shift that I think makes a huge difference. And people respond to that much more than they do about messages about body size.
Thank you so much for that, Felice. The piece that feels very important are the myths that you're highlighting. The first one you mentioned from the Amend trial, the myth that young men don't change how they eat, don't care about what they eat. Jessica Bays, the lead researcher on that study, said that's not true. You talked to the young men and they said, thanks for seeing me and how depressed I am and helping me think about my food. 100% of young men in that trial changed how they ate. 36 went into full remission. And this next myth that eating is just about our body size, that is independent of mood. And I think often we conflate those. I know I do. I often speak about the increased risk of depression with obesity, diabetes, prediabetes, and metabolic syndrome. I think it's really important that independent of those, shifting how you eat can massively impact your mood. And we all know when we're not struggling with depression and mood symptoms, we take better care of ourselves. We take better care of those around us. We do a better job at being our best self.
And how much of that risk that we see associated with obesity and metabolic syndrome is actually coming from the lifestyle behaviours that have created that physical condition rather than the condition itself? And that's not being asked.
The prevention data is so striking, beginning with Amuda Sanchez Villegas's study is really where it struck out to me. I think that was 2009, showing this really strong linear correlation between dietary quality, more Mediterranean diet, type of diet you lead during college, leading to no matter how they sliced it up, 30 to 50% reduction in the risk of depression over 4.5 years.
And there's been many studies that have shown that. And when you look at the actual intervention data, I mean, in PrediMed, it's the largest dietary trial that's ever been run around the world, and it was designed to see if they could prevent cardiovascular events in people who are at risk of having cardiovascular events. So it wasn't designed to look at prevention of depression, and they didn't really have enough people that went on to develop depression to be able to test it properly. But when you look at the data, there is a very strong signal that people who were on the Mediterranean diet were at reduced risk of developing depression for the first time. Remember, these are older adults. And for people with type 2 diabetes, that was statistically significant. And we do seem to see in the literature this even stronger link between the diet quality and the risk of depression in people who have type 2 diabetes. So the prevention data are there. There's another very interesting study that was actually published many years ago by Chip Reynolds in the US, where before the field of nutritional psychiatry became much more well known, it was a trial looking at people who had elevated depressive symptoms, and he was testing the impact of a particular type of psychotherapy to prevent depression happening. People transitioning to full case depression. And without knowing the literature, the control condition was actually a dietary improvement intervention. And they were kind of stunned to find that even though, again, they didn't have many people transitioning to full depression, so that was a limitation of the study, but that the dietary intervention seemed to be just as helpful as the psychotherapy. And indeed, when they looked 2 years later, people were still doing much better.
That was such a great trial. I mean, that in some ways, if we track the history of nutritional psychiatry, that was really one of the first trials, really kind of landmark in a certain way. It was the first RCT that said, they didn't even call it nutritional psychiatry. If I remember, they got government pamphlets and they helped people plan. And I thought one of the ways that maybe helped is food insecurity in the elderly increases the risk of depression by about 10 times, as you know.
Oh,
And I wonder
yeah,
if
I
it's
can
part of
imagine.
it is just, that partnership. If you're feeling overwhelmed and going to the store is maybe a little challenging and budgeting has gotten harder, just maybe lost a step with some of those skills as you've aged, having somebody partner with you and help you celebrate the wins and budget a little bit, it's really huge. That was I think it was Elizabeth Stahl was the lead on that. Such a cool
I
study.
know, but what I loved is that it was a kind of an accident, like it was an
Yeah,
unexpected
right, right.
thing.
I know. I feel sorry for the reacher who was designing it. Was a problem solving psychotherapy for the elderly with depression, and it's tough to beat brain food. I think was the lesson of that study.
Yeah, I know. I love that. So I think the evidence is really there and it's growing. We certainly need more research, but that is underway at the moment. We are very focused at the Food and Mood Centre on understanding how this is working because there's so many ways in which diet affects the fundamental pathways that in turn affect mental health. So your immune system, first and foremost, but things like your mitochondria and how they work. This very important part of the brain called the hippocampus that is very responsive to things that change in your environment. It's part of your ability to learn and remember. This is the hippocampus, strongly linked to appetite regulation, but also to mental health. And we know from all the animal studies that when you modify diet, that has a big impact on the hippocampus. But we now have 3 studies, some very large studies, showing that the quality of your diet is linked to the size of your hippocampus. And in fact, we led the first study in humans to show that in older people. And this is really important because as you get older, your hippocampus shrinks, you start to forget your kids' names, all those sorts of things. And this showed that people with healthier diets had much bigger hippocampi, and it wasn't a tiny effect size. It was actually a really big effect size.
I remember, and I love the study because all of us translating this and trying to encourage people and make content to help people just make better choices for their mental health. It's so concrete. Hey, look at this 5-year study by Felice Jacka and her team. They did MRIs. They looked at how people ate, and the folks who ate a really low-quality Western diet, their brain shrank so much faster that, it's sort of it's a measurable cubic millimeter size that you can envision, and that's all brain cells. And who wouldn't want more brain cells?
Well, that's right. And what we find, though, that's so interesting is all these aspects of our physiology that we know are involved in mental and brain health are influenced by diet. But we find that the gut and the gut microbiota are a really key part of all of this because diet is one of the major factors affecting your gut microbes and what they do. And it seems to be linked to all of those other things, that your tryptophan metabolism that helps to, make serotonin for your brain, your mitochondrial function, your inflammation and oxidative stress, even your epigenetics, how your genes turn on and off. These are all influenced by your gut microbes, your hippocampus, your blood-brain barrier and the integrity of that, all of these things. And that's a very concrete thing that people can understand. You put food in, it goes down, the bugs do things with it, and those things that they do, these thousands of molecules that they produce, interact with every single system in your body. So it's concrete, it's very immediate, people get it. And so this is something we're really doing a lot of research to look at and understand better.
Felice, I'd feel remiss if I didn't mention you. I think, and your husband produced also a beautiful book for kids to understand the microbiome. I think The Zoo in My Poo.
Yes, there's a zoo in my poo. And the idea is that kids they're really smart. If they get that what they eat is going to affect their zoo, their own personal zoo, and this concept of them as the zookeeper, we find that they're really responsive to that. And it was also great fun to write it.
And it's a lot of fun to drink kombucha with kids, alcohol-free kombucha, of course, but it's a good time. Um, I want to get back to talking about you and alcohol a little bit, but before that, since you mentioned mitochondria, there's a lot of buzz about ketosis, and ketosis feels like it's one of those things that kind of keeps coming back, beginning way back with the Banting diet and then moving through a variety of different versions in America, the South Beach diet or a paleo diet, but a diet that's low carbohydrates. And there's a lot of interest, particularly around severe mental illness and bipolar disorder and a few case studies, but it doesn't seem to be a lot of robust science. And I was just curious your take on ketosis and how it applies to mental health.
Look, I think it's a really important issue because if you look at a ketogenic diet, except for a very, very careful one that is explicitly designed to really address fiber and polyphenols and healthy fats rather than saturated fats, it is really the opposite of what the evidence tells us is the type of diet that is really good for mental health and very good for gut health because it's low in complex carbohydrates, which are the bacteria's food. In the States, I think there's a misunderstanding that carbs are bad because they conflate donuts with sweet potatoes or oats, and they're completely different things. But also the food system in the US is particularly bad. I think ketosis and that how that interacts with mitochondria and brain energy, it's a very important topic to look at. We're doing a pilot study in Finland at the moment in people with psychosis and employing a healthy version of a ketogenic diet, one that really focuses on, olive oil, fish, nuts, those sorts of things. It may be that type of diet is really helpful for certain people with certain conditions, such as schizophrenia, such as bipolar disorder, but we don't have the data yet. And the fact is that a ketogenic diet can be really quite dangerous for some people. There was a really interesting study done in Norway. What they did was they took young, healthy people, like people 30 and under, in the healthy weight range, and they put them on a ketogenic diet. And within a week, a couple of them were in hospital. They had severe medical events. Some people, like their cholesterol, blood cholesterol increased, doubled to a dangerous level. There were some findings that weren't great for people's health. So the point is that a ketogenic diet can be an unhealthy diet. It needs a lot of guidance by a dietitian to do it in a way that's not going to, cause nutritional problems. And we don't have the evidence yet. That's not to say that there's not the potential there for it to be helpful, but we do need to do generate the evidence base first.
And it also sounds like you're convinced that even on a ketogenic diet, fiber, polyphenols, and a diversity of plants is absolutely critical to gut health and to brain health and mental health.
That's right. And the right type of fats too, of course. So this is what the evidence shows over and over again. There is no evidence to show anything different to that. No convincing evidence to show that a diet that doesn't have those types of foods is going to be beneficial at this point.
It's one of the exciting pieces that the Metabolic Psychiatry Center at Stanford, I think, and the Bazooki Foundation has funded a number of ketogenic trials. So we'll really have data. Because for so long early in nutritional psychiatry, I had a lot more neurotic angst because you go and you speak and there, until some of your trials came out, there weren't RCTs and you can only say so much. And so I think the same thing with the ketogenic diet. We all have opinions, and I certainly, for patients with mood cycling disorders, it seems to help a lot. In part, that's because it gets people off of processed food. It gets people to stop drinking. Yeah. It gets people, off of simple sugars. And also there's that really empowering feeling of being disciplined. Yeah. So I look forward to hopefully talking in the future with you about some of those results and thinking through. And I love your note. Let's stop pretending it's one disease. Right? People have depression for a lot of different reasons. Let's stop pretending there's one diet. Right? We can't. It's not the Mediterranean diet, or I'm where I'm from, that means pizza, right? And there's a way that as we educate clinicians to do a better job, and also work in multidisciplinary teams, the notion that if in Australia exercise and nutrition are going to be foundational, it's not just that we equip the psychiatrists and psychologists with nutrition skills. That's true. But one of the things that I've just loved recently is helping equip other health professionals, whether they're coaches or nutritionists or exercise physiologists, helping equip them with some mental health skills and empowering them. Not that you're going to go run a psychoanalysis or you're going to figure out, a medication management, but simply acknowledging and attending to and thinking about mental health and prioritizing it and caring about it in patients. It's so powerful. I just remember so clearly when Jessica Baez, she was just like, these young men felt seen.
Yeah, and what we see too in the literature, we did a meta-analysis looking at dietary interventions, and they happened to have measured depressive symptoms, even though the interventions were for other reasons, and showing again and again that dietary improvement improves depressive symptoms, but it seems to be particularly helpful if a nutrition professional delivers that guidance rather than just like a research assistant. So it's not only a matter, from our point of view, of educating clinicians and psychiatrists and GPs, etc., but also educating the dietitians in how to best work with a mental health patient, someone who maybe is experiencing a lot of fatigue, a lot of lack of motivation, brain fog, all of those things, because that takes particular skills as well. So that's what we'll be working on next year, is training for dietitians, and we work closely with dietitians, and a lot of our researchers in the Food and Mood Centre are actually from a dietetics background. But just going back to the metabolic psychiatry and what's being done at Stanford and the Bazooki Foundation, I really, really welcome the investment in research. I think that's what we need, is good quality research to inform practice. And without that, we're really flying blind, and you get back to the dark ages of making recommendations that are just not based on evidence, like with, say, orthomolecular medicine, for example, that can be problematic. So we need the evidence, and we really welcome the research, and I can't wait until this research is published.
Felice, it was so surreal, and I wish you would have been there. The Bazooki Family Foundation had a little suite and did a presentation, an evening kind of dinner, or an appetizers kind of thing, just sort of stand around and go. But it was the best food that's ever been served at the American Psychiatric Association. I mean, it's just this amazing keto spread with like shrimp and lamb chops. And I just love that you mentioned how important it is to have people who care about nutritional psychiatry, who are funding trials. I just felt overwhelmed actually that evening listening to Matt talk and listening to their passion about finding better new science, making better new science. I think it's 6 or 7 trials. So, and just a simple one. There's never ever, just like you did the first trial ever of a Mediterranean diet or any diet to intervene with depression intentionally, there's never been a trial of a ketogenic diet for clinical depression.
No.
I mean, we just don't know. And so it's so exciting to think that. I think that's being done at Ohio. So we're going to have really, really cool science coming down the pike. And
it is really interesting. Although one of the things that you touched on is it the ketosis, or is it the fact that you're removing all these ultra-processed foods and sugars and things from the diet? So I would love to see a trial where it's a ketogenic diet versus, say, a Mediterranean-style diet versus whatever the control condition is. I think we
should throw, sorry to interrupt, a little intermittent fasting. That I'm not in ketosis. This is probably where I try and style it a little bit. I'm going to have, a reasonably low carb dinner. I'm going to start my day with a black coffee or maybe a little half and half in there. And I'm going to start grinding because my brain's feeling good. And I don't think I'm full into ketosis, but, I'm not going to have a huge, by avoiding all processed foods and being really mindful in carbohydrate intake, it feels that there are moments where certainly you're flexing into some ketosis. And I've always been very curious about that kind of threading the needle. You're not just shrimp and steak and cheese. So I get to have my broccoli and my avocados and my olive oil, but it's a very simple diet. Lots of nuts, right? Like high carb foods are like black beans, where there's always a lot of fiber coming with it. And it's a very exciting time to
It needs to be done very carefully because the fiber is key. If you think about your gut microbes, what they're really there for is to help you break down aspects of your diet and food that can't be broken down by human enzymes. And when they break them down through a process of fermentation, it releases thousands of different molecules. Now, these molecules interact profoundly with the immune system. And in fact, 70% of our immune cells are actually in the gut. They interact with virtually every process in the body, including glucose regulation, body weight, all of these things. Now, if you don't feed those gut microbes, they can't do that job. And the foods that they need to break down to create these molecules are from complex carbohydrates. They are fiber. They're things that you get from beans and lentils, from different types of whole grains, from some vegetables and things, but a lot of the fiber that you get from vegetables is not fermentable. You need a lot of different types, including fermentable fibers. And what we know from the research evidence is that people who go on to low carbohydrate diets, they lose beneficial bacteria like bifidobacteria that produce butyrate, which is anti-inflammatory. So they lose some of those keystone or those really important bacteria. They become less abundant because they're not giving them the fiber from the complex carbohydrates that they need. So this is what concerns me with the ketogenic diet is once you start reducing those forms of carbohydrate, you're reducing bacterial food. The other aspect, of course, that's very important is polyphenols. So polyphenols are one set, I guess, of it's estimated there might be as many as 150,000 different types of phytochemicals in plant foods. We've only really scoped maybe 20,000 of those, and less than half of those fall into the polyphenol camp, but that's where we've got more evidence. And when you take food and break it down and take it out of its food matrix and out of its natural state, which is what happens with ultra-processed foods, those phytochemicals are diminished, if not, deleted. When you look more broadly at the global industrial food system, we know from the UN Food Summit in 2021, I think, they did a report that calculated the cost of the global industrialized food system at roughly $20 trillion a year. Now that's, if you think about it, the whole GDP of China is about 16 trillion a year. So this is a massive, massive cost. Now, about 11 trillion of that is the cost to human health. About 7 trillion is the cost to the environment through what we are doing with soil. Soil is microbes and fungi talking to each other, getting these phytochemicals into plants, getting nutrients into plants. When you use these monocrops and you decimate the land, you pull everything out of it, you add herbicides and pesticides and fungicides, you're destroying that, which means fewer phytochemicals in foods, less nutrition. The biodiversity of the environment interacts strongly with the biodiversity in humans, our microbes, which are incredibly important to our health. We developed with them a symbiotic relationship. They can't live without us. We can't live without them. We've got a review coming out soon that talks about all of the different microbes that live in and on us. The archaea, the viruses, the parasites, the bacteria, how they interact with each other and human health, not just in the gut, in the mouth, in the lungs, in all of these different orifices. When we destroy the biodiversity of the planet, which is what we're doing, we also destroy our own biodiversity. And when we eat ultra-processed foods that don't have those phytochemicals, they're taken out of their food matrix, we're missing out on really incredibly important things for our human health. And no wonder that we're seeing this massive epidemic of autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, and allergic diseases, asthma, eczema, these types of things. So many illnesses, particularly we're seeing in young people, getting all of these conditions. Why is that? One is we've got antibiotics right the way through the food chain. Antibiotics, the major use of antibiotics is in industrialized foods, in cattle and animals that are bred for supermarkets. We're seeing supermarket chickens that have been fed with last line antibiotics that should only be used in the most dire of situations. And of course, people are being exposed to antibiotics from the very start of life in clinical care. Then we've got all of the additives that are in the processed foods, plus all the things that aren't in it. And it's no surprise that we're facing this huge epidemic of illness and that the industrialized food system and unhealthy diet is the leading cause of illness and early death now across the world.
Felice, that $20 trillion number is just so startling, right? To think about, the cost of, it's often framed as convenient or efficient, or sometimes even healthier, and it's as it really speaks to the power that we have with our forks, the power that we have in the grocery store and in our communities, and some of what I love seeing here in the United States. This huge surge went from, it's like 800 farmers markets to over 10,000 farmers markets in the United States pre-COVID, and I'm sure it's recovered. And so, just that huge interest. I'm wondering if part of the Australian government's response has been to get involved with school food and translating. You're the only country that has a nutritional psychiatry center. That's it. There's no official training center or academic institution that has anything formal in nutritional psychiatry except for you and your center. And I was wondering, is that helping the government sort of change and shift policy and change and shift really important things like how you feed kids in school?
No, I would love to be able to say otherwise. But the fact is that the global
Not
food
yet.
system...
Just to make this little session.
Not yet.
Not yet.
That's right. These big industrial players are the largest companies in the world, and they are more powerful than any nation-state government, even the US government. So getting change is incredibly difficult because of the power of the money and the lobbying behind the global food industry and these huge multinational corporations that make ultra-processed foods. Did you know that on average, 60% of energy intake in the US is coming from ultra-processed foods? People don't even recognize that when they're consuming something out of a box, they think it's a pasta meal or a pizza or something like that it's okay. It's actually ultra-processed and it's not going to be great for their body or their brain.
Can you help us understand what's the difference between a processed food, me chopping up my salad, processing it, and an ultra-processed food?
So an ultra-processed food is where originally food is taken apart. It's basically broken down into all these constituents and reformulated. And to identify a processed food, you'd look at the packaging and you would see very likely things like emulsifiers and preservatives and lots of different additives in it. Now, processed food, great. A pre-cut salad, fantastic. When you make bread or your local farmer's market, you get bread that's been made properly. That's processed. That's okay. It's the ultra-processed stuff that's hugely
Pesto is my best example.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the most interesting studies in the last few years was led by Kevin Hall at the NIH, who's probably one of the best nutrition researchers in the world. And they basically locked people up and they fed them a diet that was either not ultra-processed or ultra-processed. It was matched as much as they possibly could, including on palatability. When people were on the ultra-processed food diet, they ate on average about 500 more calories a day, because it seems that these ultra-processed foods somehow bypass, if you like, the body's natural appetite regulation systems, and they also really interact with the reward systems of the brain to prompt people to want to eat more of them. And this is great for the pockets of the large multinational corporations that make these foods, but really, really terrible for our health.
It gets a little overwhelming sometimes when I think about it, of the amount of processed food and the way that system's very ensconced. It sounds almost like idealistic to note by far the most important asset we have as a planet are our children's minds. And if we feed them a certain set of foods, top research shows they have a lower risk of depression, anxiety, and ADHD. When they do have those disorders and we serve them the best brain foods, they do better and they get better outcomes. And when we address mental health in this multidimensional way with movement, with better sleep, with better food, and with making sure people have resources that they need, like medications and therapy, we just know we do better. And it's just sometimes it gets sort of upsetting to me. We have all this research. You've worked so hard to prove this. And we still are really having a system that's very, very slow to change. When we know based on the pandemic, systems, when forced to, can radically change incredibly quickly. And I'm not sure what it's going to take. I mean, in America, the school mental health situation is as bad as it gets. Most of our kids go to school terrified they're going to get shot. And so it seems maybe, again, that people, like it's a far stretch, and I don't mean to tie school shootings to nutrition, but more tying overall, how we're thinking about this system of nutrition. And I'm wondering where you see the bright lights.
Like I'm on the steering committee for a World Economic Forum New Frontiers in Nutrition initiative, and it's really designed to try and tackle some of this, make some recommendations. And the key question that we keep coming back to is, how do we change this system? So we can talk to policymakers till we're blue in the face, but they will not change unless the people who vote for them change, until the lobbyists and the money behind these huge multinational corporations are limited in their activities and their influence. And it comes back to consumers. It comes back to people on the ground voting with their wallets when they go and buy food or don't buy food, more importantly, voting with their voice, whether it's on the school council, whether it's in their local community elections, whether it's at their national elections, voting. It's about the people on the ground. It's about all of us going, no, we're not accepting this anymore. And that comes down to education for people to understand why it's important. And I think once people understand that what they feed their children is influencing their mental and brain health, their neurocognitive outcomes, that they can make a huge difference in preventing the intergenerational transmission of disease by changing what they're feeding their families. That's very powerful. When people know that by making different choices about what they buy at the supermarket and what they eat, they can be making a real difference to their mental health, their ability to learn and remember very, very quickly. We see in the trials that within 3 weeks, people are experiencing a really profound benefit. So getting that education piece out there, and this is where we've spent a lot of effort in trying to get this into the media. So the work that we've led has now been, and you would know this, on the front cover of the Scientific American Mind, Time Magazine, Oprah Magazine, New York Times, all of these vehicles for getting information out to the public. It's slow, but it is happening. And I think the new knowledge of the gut and the gut microbes and how important they are in health is helping that, because now people understand how it might work. It makes it more concrete. So we can only hope that things will get better, but money is the big driver of all of this.
Felice, a long time ago, I think I influenced you about bivalves.
Yes, and I still don't love oysters, but I actually make myself eat them at least once a week because they are little powerhouses of nutrition and zinc and omega-3 fatty acids and all of those good things. Mussels, where I live, we have some of the best mussels in the world, so I do eat those and I quite like them. But I do talk to people about how great oysters are in terms of getting those key nutrients into yourself.
Well, Felice, it's such a treat to speak with you and to hear the real kind of cutting edge of nutritional psychiatry, what you and your team are involved in. When I heard that I was involved in your bivalve life in any way, it felt to me like being knighted by the queen of nutritional psychiatry. And it also piqued my interest because you said something very interesting to me around what affects your mood. And as somebody who also has a mood that's a little wonky at times, I thought it was interesting what you said about alcohol. I'd really, I love to drink alcohol. I love wine like you. And about 2 years ago, I was able to stop drinking, and it's been
Oh
really
dear,
interesting. And
it's
I
frozen
was kind of
again.
wondering if it's okay to ask you kind of where you are in your thinking about it. And I don't know, maybe it's a little bit arrogant, but if there's any way that I could be of any help with that.
Look, I think any help is always appreciated. One of the things that is problematic. I've had breast cancer twice, and so in 2020 I had chemotherapy and a whole lot of nasty treatments for breast cancer, and I'm fine now. I'm great, thank goodness. But of course, that has a big impact on your body and my liver, and so now I'm even less able to manage alcohol. I have found some really great like sour beers and different types of beers that are low or zero alcohol. So I use those, which is great. But it is a struggle because particularly when you work really hard, and for me, I find I'm an anxious person. Relaxing and turning off is difficult. I practice my breathing. I'm trying to do the right things, but I'm certainly not perfect.
Well, I think there's also something that's a little automatic about alcohol, right? That just kind of feeling of release, and you don't have to work for it. You kind of have to have discipline to meditate. We've got to put on the running shoes to run. I think some of the things that are helpful is just the timeline that takes a little while. I found that a lot of people, myself included, had stopped for a month. And I found at about 90 days, something came back about my creativity. And not that I was drinking too excessively, it was just more of just not having it at all in my system. And then there was a habituation. It's funny. It's sort of after 6 months, but particularly like a year, it just kind of isn't on the mind in a way. I think it is a little challenging because you quickly see how much it's a part of the culture, particularly as a man. Like, what do I go and meet up with my friends? Hey, you guys want to go have like some matcha? Everyone teases me like, hey, let's go get a kombucha. And I do think there's something about the sugar and the fizz. I found, and I hate this word mocktail. Someone's got to come up with a better word. Like, don't mock me. I'm trying not to drink, like, but I found that for a little while, something, a little sugar, a little fizziness, and making sure I had that dialed in at 4 p.m. And I was thinking about it in the same way. I was going to go and I was going to give myself a real treat. And sure, it doesn't hit you like a nice glass of wine, but I also think some of the hops are kind of psychoactive. So there are a lot of hopped kombuchas and hop waters. I don't know have you ever seen any literature that hops are psychoactive? I just find people really get hooked on the IPAs. I kind of did.
I'll
And I
have to
was
look
like,
into
there's
that.
something to those.
I haven't seen that, but I will look
Definitely.
into that. I mean, I'm in a country that
You
makes
heard
the
it here
most.
first.
We have the most amazing wine in Australia. I mean, like really great. Like South Africa, we have incredible Rieslings, incredible reds. But on the other hand, what we also have is a growing number of bars and restaurants and things that are alcohol free, a whole bar that you can go to that just has the full spread of low alcohol drinks or no alcohol drinks. And I think that whole area is really growing. And the person who develops a non-alcohol wine that tastes like real wine will be a millionaire, because that's what I love, is the taste of it. I mean, I also love the effect that it has on you, but I really love the taste.
Well, it was last year, the year before, was the first time a non-alcoholic beer brand won Best Brewery in America. I think it's Athletic Brewing. And they are really like craft brewers who take the alcohol out. And you see, they call them NAs now. So many people are really taking it more seriously. And I think it's part of a nutritional psychiatry influence trend that, just going out, drinking the same old thing, getting drunk in the same old way, it's really bad for your mental health. It's avoiding the best of you. Well, I think it's a little tough in that culture of Australia, right? Such a drinking culture, and you do have such
It
great
really
wine.
is. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it really is, and we are one of the biggest countries in the world. We really and so social events are all about the alcohol very often. So stepping out of that is tricky, particularly when you're someone who tends to be. I love food and I love flavor and I love taste, and wine is so much a part of that. So that's difficult to do without. But I agree that the low alcohol, the no alcohol beers are fantastic.
and it's a little less, it takes a little while to tap into fun, maybe. That I think, effectively, I think you and I love to eat and drink. And at that ISNPR meal that we had years ago with it's like all of the prominent researchers in nutritional psychiatry and everyone come to the US for the first time. And that meal was just epic, and having some drinks was a part of it. But I do think that over time, for me, there's been something about like finding the fun again and really feeling a little bit better, able to be present and I don't know, something about, when you don't drink, you don't really worry about what you said as much. And it, but Felice, you didn't come to this podcast to stop drinking, and I'm not suggesting that, but I love the idea of offering any help I can. The other one that people miss a lot, I think, is naltrexone, that low dose naltrexone or like a lower dose naltrexone, of just really helping when people are struggling with like, wanting to have one, but having four. And it
Really?
blocks a little bit of the pleasure. Yeah, it's a low dose naltrexone is a little opioid blocker.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
the idea there is you short circuit the pleasure activation, that euphoric thing that happens as kind of an opioid-ish response. And so you block that. And so that's a little bit of a bummer, but you still feel the actual effects of alcohol, which are, you feel a little more tired, a little more sad, and you don't have the kind of euphoria to make that not matter because you're going to get another one. At least that's how I kind of explain it to patients, because so many patients with depression really crave carbs late at night. Is there a
Mm.
role for something like a naltrexone sometimes?
That's so interesting because I have a friend who is living with chronic fatigue syndrome at the moment, and they told me that they are about to try naltrexone for chronic fatigue, which I didn't know was a thing. So I'm going to look into that. I think that's a really, really helpful suggestion.
Well, thank you, Felice. I'd love to consider myself, one of your personal nutritional psychiatrists. And more than that, it's just always a treat to talk with you. I learn so much. I want to just thank you from all of us in the nutritional psychiatry community, as somebody who, our team cobbled together a training that we have for clinicians, and had a lot of support. But I think we've always, all of us, hoped for there to be a real grounding anchor institution led by some by you and Michael Burke, one of, I think, the most cited researchers in the world in mental health. And to have you both committed to and interested in depression and changing world global health policy, it's just a delight. And from the very first days when I was a psychiatry resident and I was thinking about fish and omega-3s, and I felt like a weirdo, now 20 years later, to be here with you, it really means a lot to me. And I'm just so grateful for everything you do for us. So,
Well, you too, Drew. It goes both ways. I mean, you've been a real forerunner in promoting this field and getting it into clinical practice, and it's so valuable. But if people want to know more about the research, I mean, our Food and Mood Centre website now has a huge number of resources on it. You can just go to the website. Our team now is more than 50, and researchers and students, and we're doing so many very interesting things. Much of our research got really held up from COVID, but this year we're going to be producing a whole host of papers with results of very, very cool clinical trials, and microbiome research and fermented foods research and ultra processed foods research and all sorts of things. That's all in the offing. So do keep an eye on our Google Scholar and our Food and Mood Centre. And if people want to know there's lots of resources on there as well, including our free online course in nutritional psychiatry, which has thus far enrolled more than 80,000 students from more than 190 countries. And it's free.
it's so, I mean, when I saw that statistic online after I dealt with a little jealousy, I was just blown away. That is so, so incredible. Yeah. Also, boy, I have got to plan out a sabbatical and come and hang out with you for a couple years in Australia. And I'm not the best researcher, but I'm fun. I'm fun, and I make okay Instagram reels. We can work something out, Felice. We can work something out.
Definitely. I would love that. And we can eat oysters together.
Well, everyone, it's been a wonderful, wonderful time with Felice Jacka, really the leader in nutritional psychiatry. And I'm so thrilled that she can come with us and share really one of the most critical aspects of lifestyle medicine, of nutritional psychiatry, this notion of us really returning to a lot of the foods we ate, more plants, more of the foods Felice mentioned, and just the impact it has on our mental health. Felice, can you leave us with a final thought, something that's been on your mind in terms of how we can do a better job eating for our mental health?
Look, I think when people understand that this is about how you feel and how you operate and not about how you look, it makes the message and the changes easier to make. And you start slow, bit by bit, try and just get more whole foods, fewer processed foods into your diet, and maybe try some fermented foods, some sauerkraut, some kimchi, some kombucha, some kefir, because we're increasingly understanding that that could be a very powerful way of improving health. When we have new findings coming out, which will be over the next 6 months or so, very happy to come on again and chat and talk through the results, because we've got one very important paper that's under review at Nature Medicine at the moment, and there'll be more.
Thank you so much, Felice. What a delight to get to speak with you and hear about all the details of your work. And I look forward to speaking with you more soon. And it's just such a treat to be your colleague. Everybody, thanks for joining us. Make sure to share this with people in your community who need to hear from the top researcher in nutritional psychiatry. Hear it from the source. And please leave any comments below. Sign up so you don't miss any episodes. And I look forward to seeing you really soon.